Well, there were three people in this marriage, so it got a little crowded. So how better to introduce a woman like Princess Diana than by her own words from the infamous interview, which I'm sure we'll get to later.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. I mean, there's a lot of ground to cover with Diana, isn't there? But let me start by saying, so you've got your Marilyn Monroes, you've got your Grace Kellys, you've got Golden Age glamour Hollywood, and then you've got Princess Diana, one of the most photographed women in the world. And when she passed away, I was quite young, so we didn't necessarily see much of her life, but let me just say that I think that she in particular outshines all of them. I have never seen somebody with such charisma that the charisma can jump out at you from a photo or from a clip of film. And if she was like that in photos, I can't imagine the charisma that she gave off in real life if you were ever in a room with her. So for me, I think quite possibly the most charismatic woman that there's ever been.
I wouldn't even say that was an understatement, because if you want to sort of be critical, which I think is probably the only time I'm going to be critical this entire podcast today. If you want to be critical, I would say if you take some of her features in isolation, they don't necessarily work in terms of like a traditionally beautiful sense. Like, you know, you got your Grace Kellys and, as you said, your Marilyn Monroes, and they've got all of those sorts of things, and yet somehow she managed as a sort of, if not be on the same level, to sort of outshine them, which is something quite strange, really. I would say Queen Elizabeth certainly had an element of that, especially when it comes to like the pictures she took when she was younger, when she was first coronated. But the weird thing about Princess Diana was she looked like she just come out of the page, and it is just quite exceptional. And I do think a lot of it is to do with the eyes, if we're going to be sort of particular about, you know, the physical beauty that she certainly had. But as I said, some features you can take in isolation, and yet the whole package, so to speak, was just exceptionally beautiful, up there with those sorts of figures as you described. Absolutely.
I would say that, like what you said, that I would say that she does eclipse them. I'm not saying this from someone who's, just like a huge Diana fan, and just because I'm British, I mean, I am a huge Diana fan, but I'm also a huge film fan. So these stars that we talk about, I hold in an extremely high regard. But Princess Diana, for some reason, and you can call it an X factor, you can call it whatever you want, there was just something about her. And that something made her the most photographed woman in the world. But the thing when you're charismatic is you just command things, right? So if she walked into a room, heads would turn for no apparent reason. And I do agree, I don't think she's perhaps the most beautiful in the most conventional sense, but who needs to be beautiful when you're the most charismatic person in the world?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was like it was strange because, I mean, I think we're going to go into depictions so maybe slightly further down the line, but while we're talking on the subject, particularly when you compare it to like the movie stars, there's been depictions of her, and it just, none of them, it's like you don't hold a candle. I mean, she was just a candle in the wind. Sorry, that was really unintentional. You don't hold a candle in the wind. But they don't, like, to that sort of thing. And it's quite strange, really, considering the big, I mean, you don't want to call it a number one hit because it was so solemn and tragic. But one of I think it's still the biggest selling song in the UK, was Candle in the Wind. But Elton originally did that for Marilyn Monroe, and so then he rebranded it, if you want to call it that, for her funeral, and then it just went into the stratosphere in terms of sales and coverage. I mean, it was probably number one forever. I think it's still the highest selling song. I think that Do You Know It's Christmas or whatever might be up there as well, but I think that is, as a single released on one date, I think that's still head and shoulders above the second place, as a single released at the time. So, I mean, strange that you bring the Marilyn Monroe connection, because apparently it doesn't seem that you'd be the only one to make such a comparison.
Yeah, I think comparison probably can't be made in the way that they were both taken young and things like that. But in Candle in the Wind is a good song to attribute to her, 100%. Like, she will never be forgotten, never, ever, 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 ever. Not just in the history books, but for the one of the first times in history we were able to have photos of people, we're able to have film of people, and all of this people in the future can look back on. But the thing with Diana as well is, there's a clip that I like of Charles giving a speech, and I forget where he was, but she was sat behind him, and I think it was newly in the marriage, and he said something, and then she just gave like this little look, and she literally just looked and like gave a wry smile, after he said something about being a husband, I think. And the entire room erupted in laughter and interrupted Charles's speech, to the point where he turned around and he was like, "Oh, what are you doing? You've been naughty behind there," or something like that. And that's what I mean about the kind of level of charisma that woman had. So there's a man standing up speaking, giving a speech with a microphone, but everyone's looking at her.
Everyone's looking at her. This is the hilarious part, because I'm just as guilty now. Like, I think you probably are quite similar with me, and I don't know if any people who might be listening to this have the same thing, but I always like to look to the past, and to, like, especially with interesting figures who've been of cultural significance. And you don't really get much more culturally significant than that lady. You really don't. It is about as its pinnacle. And so I've watched quite a few of her past interviews, with Charles specifically, because I think maybe if we take it in isolation, because I think there is a complete separation between the two. Young Diana, but Diana when she met Charles, to Diana when she broke up with Charles, or they split up, whatever you want to call it. But when they were interviewed together, he tried to play the regal role, but it always seemed quite forced, because if you go back in archive footage, to his mom, like Queen Elizabeth, and his grandfather, and it's like Prince George and stuff, King George, it was always like very sort of equal. They were looking at sort of both of them, but I suppose they were king at the time, so maybe it's slightly different. But in terms of just the ability to sort of present yourself as regal, it always seemed like it's something that he tried and strived to do, despite all of the training that he had, basically since the day he was born, and it became a thing even that his mother was going to be queen. Then he was next in line. So obviously they go through all of the preparation for such an eventuality. So he'd had decades on her, and so they married, and it was she just didn't even need to try,
Yeah, this is difficult because I want to talk about this, but I also want to sort of say some maybe background about Diana first. But let me just chime in and say this now. He's an absolute idiot. Like if he'd have just loved her, he could have been in such a power couple, such a power couple. And I say that, I mean, I know that he's king now, so um, there does come power with that, but then it's not sort of power that you can use. It's a strange system in the UK that we've got in regards to royals. But if he'd have just stayed with Diana, like the popularity of them in the royal family would have skyrocketed, and all he had to do was love her. That's all he had to do. So I just want to say that about Prince Charles. But yeah, I do. So in regards to Diana, so obviously Diana's father was an earl. Her mother's father was a baron. So she was an aristocrat in and of herself. But I do agree with you 100%. She just looks like she's been trained from birth, and of course she hadn't. But whatever it is, she just had it. She understood. She got the training that she needed to over however many weeks or even days, and she did what was required of her. She was perfect for that, absolutely perfect. And when they got married, she was only 20, but it is the 80s, and that's sort of how old people were when they got married. Like my mum had my sister when she was 20, me when I was 24. Most of my friends who are my age, our mums and dads are all the kind of same age. That was just what was done back then. You just got married young. So she is very young in that, and I do agree with what you're saying. She does kind of grow, and you can see that she's getting used to being herself. Like we all do, we go through our 20s in this tumultuous time, and then by the time we're kind of like 30s and mid 30s, we've kind of found ourselves. We know what we want and everything like that. And it was definitely a progression for Diana, especially with the divorce, because I feel like that was a turning point for her. She was able to sort of step away from the unhappiness and finally agree to that.
Well, definitely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, in terms of that progression, just before they did get wed, obviously they'd had they were sort of courting, I think you'd call it. I don't know if that's an exclusively British term, but yeah, courting is basically when you're sort of seeing each other before before the the next phase of a relationship. I mean, I suppose that's got a lot to do with the real thing, is like real courtship, that kind of stuff. But before that, she was I think she was like a nanny, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was a
She was a
nursery
nanny
assistant,
before
like
that.
a nursery nurse. That's what she was before, yeah. So she was working and things like that. And just while we're talking about Charles and Diana in the early days, let me just clear up, because I spoke to someone about this recently, and they were very quick to tell me that the first time Charles met Diana was when Diana was 14, and that is correct. But the spin that she put on it was kind of like, oh, it was gross and then she was groomed. That wasn't the case. The reality is probably still a bit icky, but essentially the first time Charles met Diana was at a house party when Charles was on a date with Diana's sister.
Or is it
Um,
Sarah? Is it Sarah, I think, isn't it? Is
yeah,
it Sarah Spencer?
Sarah Spencer, yeah. And Diana just happened to be there because obviously she lived there, and she was 14, and that's the first time they met, but nothing like that even happened. Nothing like that was even sort of quoted or even sinister. It was just she'd happened to be the sister of someone he went on a date with. And in regards to Sarah Spencer, nothing happened there, obviously. I think they went on one or two dates and that kind of fizzled out. And then the next time, Charles was serious about Diana was when Diana was 20. So a lot of time had passed. So I just want to clear up that there was nothing untoward about the first time that Charles met Diana.
Yeah, um, Charles, King Charles, I suppose we should say, gets a rough rap enough, but that isn't that isn't one of his what's the word I'm trying to look for, infractions, I guess you could say, or that wasn't one of the problems. But we're going to get to the problems. We'll get
The
to them.
many
Oh, and there are
problems.
plenty. There are plenty. That just isn't one of them.
Yeah, there were many problems, and I would say the first problem was the fact that they got married at all. Charles.
Say it like it is.
Well, Charles has admittedly always, always, always been in love with Camilla.
I mean, how do you? Again, I don't want to make it, because I don't think it's all about looks. I don't think it's all about everything. I think connection's probably the most important thing. Um, and he obviously didn't have it easy in the origins of that, because, she was previously married and he's got commitments and responsibilities. All that aside, and I do think we'll probably go further into that with the later response to what Diana's public attention that she brought to it eventually. You know, again, don't want to be too forgiving, but he obviously was in a tight spell, and he had the responsibilities that he had, which weren't necessarily something he chose, but he has made choices since, which is something really, again, down the line. But regardless to any of that, that's not her fault and it's not her problem.
It's not, and let's be fair to Charles for a second, even though I don't think he deserves any fairness. It it is widely known and accepted that throughout history, kings, princes, etc., would have affairs. What's the word for them that you used to call them?
Oh, like a mistress or
Yeah,
concubine.
yeah, essentially, yeah, they all would, and that was widely known. Like every king in history, I'm sure, has had one, right? But obviously they don't sort of go public. The difference with Charles is he was in love with his. And the problem, and I really want to talk about it, but I know we've got to leave that till later. So I will leave that till later. So at the start of their marriage, Charles, I don't think had ever checked out, because I don't think he'd ever checked in. He was just going through the motions.
That's such a burn.
But I think he was just going through the motions, where I do think Diana was in love. It was a fairy tale to her, I think. This prince had come and, wanted to marry her and make her dreams come true and everything like that. It wasn't the same for Charles, and there's that very famous clip, isn't there, of when they were just about to get married. And I think a journalist says to Charles, like, "Oh, are you in love, or when did you realise you fell in love?" And he says something like, "Yeah, whatever love is."
Whatever that means, or something like that, isn't it?
Whatever
Whatever
that
that
means,
means.
yeah.
Ouch. I mean, if you heard that, if someone ever said that in your presence, that's going to have especially if you're a person with deep emotions, which I genuinely believe that Diana absolutely displayed every time she presented herself, always came across as a deeply emotional person in a positive way, but somebody who really takes things in. I would say, and that I know for myself, I would certainly go, wait a second, what does that mean? I mean, it's all well and good performing for the cameras, but once the doors are closed, what then?
But that ties in with exactly what you were just mentioning before, in regards to the training and things like that. So that was a huge faux pas for Charles. He shouldn't have known better. But for some reason, he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. And Diana was smiling through it.
Especially from his mom, who is literally like, I mean, I say is, again, it's difficult for me to say was still, even to this point, but is somebody who has this absolute masterful technique of just keeping the lips sealed,
The consummate professional. Oh my goodness. The one and only. If you ever want a masterclass in how to act in public when you're at a level like that, you just have to watch her.
Well, that's it, absolutely. So you'd expect him. I mean, I suppose his dad's maybe slightly more irreverent, but his dad wasn't king, and he's supposed to be king. So, his mum is so polished and pristine, and that was a very innate thing that she had, because her training wasn't exactly as on point as what Charles would have received, especially from her. I could imagine their dynamic. She may have been quite distant because that's a role to play, and she's preparing him for what's to come from her perspective. But she absolutely, totally had that. And it's quite strange for him to be caught so petulant, which I found that to be petulant. To answer that question, from a journalist who obviously want to know the ins and outs of such a famous marriage between two people worldwide, you'd think he'd sort of understand tact, and there was no tact in that response.
Well, and to hark back to one of our other podcasts about alternative lines of succession, should have been Anne. Should have been Anne. Anne would not have made that mistake.
Oh, there was no chance. No, she wouldn't have done that. She would have. She would have kept it all good.
But we did end up with Charles. And the one good thing that Charles has given us is Diana. So that mistake was huge, and I agree with everything you've just said. It was petulant. It was petty. It was ridiculous. And Camilla was divorced, but at the same time, Camilla was also in a new relationship, with kids of her own. But again, we'll touch on that later. But for the early years of Charles and Diana's marriage, it was obviously tumultuous from the start. I think she went into it almost like a deer in headlights. She's got those big sort of doe eyes. She was clearly in love with him. He was clearly just going through the motions. And that does not mix for a happy marriage. What I find interesting though, and I'm not sure I can quite put my finger on it, maybe you have got some insight, is what was the turning point that she realised that she's got the charisma, or that she can command the room, or that she's got kind of power in regards to public perception? Do you remember a point where she sort of realised that and came out of a shell more, or anything like that?
I think it was more of a drip situation. I think the response, as you previously mentioned, to such media questions, where he was behaving petulant, it was a petulant response. Whatever that means, like it's that kind of thing. And it's him again engaging with the thing that you mentioned earlier, where she just gave a look and he responded to the look rather than held authority over the room. And the fact of the matter is, he lost his authority over any room that she was in. And so it's difficult to say when she realised. I mean, I would say that he realised probably immediately, particularly after the wedding. he realised that all eyes were on her. She chose the most
Oh my God, that
outlandish
dress. Was
dress.
it Emmanuel?
Yeah, it was the Emmanuels that designed it.
The biggest train you've ever seen.
But that's because she obviously had a hand to play in that.
Well,
And
if aliens landed and said, "Look, show me a dress that sort of antipies the 80s," that's the dress that you'd show. Like
I
this
mean, it was the
huge,
most garish. It was the most garish, outlandish, outrageous, ridiculous dress you've ever seen. I mean, she had a part to play in that. So this is why we do need to talk about that just a little bit more in a second. But just in response to the question that you just posed, I would say that I don't think she was ever a fool from the beginning.
No, and I agree with you. And I think sort of looking at that now, like I can't remember anything else about that wedding besides that dress. I can't tell you what Charles was wearing, the Queen was wearing. I can't tell you what carriage she arrived in. The only thing I can tell you is about the dress.
It looked like a 3-tier cake on a person.
Yeah,
With
definitely. And
the
the thing is, like, that must have been part of the fashion back then as well, you know. We all know the 80s was just everything was big, but that was the absolute biggest of the big. Like, that's as big as someone
it's
could
like
possibly
I think even like Dynasty would have blushed.
get. Definitely. And that's when the kind of world sort of opened their eyes. I mean, they did so a little bit before, because once they announced the engagement, obviously the paparazzi started following her down the street, everything like that. And she had that short haircut, and she looked very young and innocent and everything like that. And then on the wedding day, that was just something else. The world's media turned up. She looked still very young, still 20 years old, but she kind of looked like a woman, strangely enough.
Almost definitely. I mean, she chose the Emmanuels. So what I would say, just in terms of your question, because it is a really interesting question. When did sort of the switch flick in her head? I would say because she's always read as a very astute lady, very astute, very sort of on the ball, even as young as she might have been. I think she chose the Emmanuels because they're very sort of, especially if you've got that concept of what fashion is, very known for their kind of extra approach to such things. I think she probably figured out quite quickly that Charles and Camilla um, was something, especially if she fell in love with him. Because I would say that I would doubt that he would have presented that to her initially. She would have been enamored, and then it's sort of things started to trickle in, and she wanted her fairy tale, which I think what's wrong with that, you know.
There's nothing wrong with that, and essentially that's what she thought she was going to get.